get started. Thank you to everyone for joining us. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome everyone to everyone joining us from throughout the United States, Canada, the rest of the Americas, and Asia. And we welcome everyone to the webcast. Orchestrator 101, we're going to give you an overview of JD Edwards Orchestrator. My name is Keith Thomas, and I'm here with David Ruprecht, who will be our main presenter. I'll be introducing David here in a moment. But let me just say a few quick words about Syntax. As you can see, Syntax has been around a long time. We were founded in 1972, and we were IBM-based solutions. In the mid-'80s, we launched our own proprietary ERP solution known as SDM. In the '90s, we began servicing JD Edwards. And in the early part of the 20th century, we were already the leading cloud. As you can see, that's allowed us to focus on growth as we acquired Core Services in 2015, Emerald Cube Services and FIT in 2019, and these moves have brought us into the Oracle EBS and SAP spaces respectively. Next slide, David. So, Syntax has been around for a long time. We really do have the experience to support your ERP and as well as your entire IT infrastructure behind that, and we can deliver that very well. Next slide, David. Syntax is headquartered in Montreal, Canada, but as you can see, we really do have a truly global presence. And that's anchored by our data centers, which are in Montreal, Phoenix, Arizona, and Edison. And we back that with support services centers in Buenos Aires, Argentina, in India, and I'm speaking to you from Buenos Aires here today. And as you can see, we also have a very active presence in support centers as well in Mexico, China, and Germany. And that gives us the ability to deliver support on a 24/7 basis around the entire globe. Next slide, David. So here's a look at our service offerings. Everything we do is anchored around the Syntax Enterprise Cloud, and that allows private, public, or hybrid cloud solutions for JD Edwards, Oracle EBS, or SAP environments. Likewise, we offer end-to-end consulting and remote managed services to support these ERP solutions. And we do actively support all of those associated technologies, as you can see. And we also offer a number of proprietary Syntax solutions headed off by Syntax Enterprise proactive ERP monitoring. And we have several security type solutions such as Fraud ID and crypto to keep your system safe. And finally, we offer Emerald Vision, which is an SaaS BI tool that's designed for JD Edwards. Next slide. So, without any further ado, I'm going to give you David Ruprecht. David is our senior software engineer here at and David brings us a wealth of experience working in, both the JD Edwards technical and
we may have lost Keith there. As he was saying, I'm David Ruprecht. I'm a software engineer here at Syntax. I have various experience in JDE from kind of one side to another. JDE development all the way through BA, CNC, and some and 7 years technical experience. I've got all kinds of other experience as well, other than the JDE space, but mainly in that JDE space is where I've been focusing. As far as software engineering, I mainly engineer on eCare, but then also support the Orchestrator team and doing a lot of Orchestrator work for our clients. Going through the agenda that we have here, we have Orchestrator 101 training agenda. We're going to go through the introductions. That was just for me. We're going to go through what is Orchestrator or Orchestrator Studio, what exactly that means. We're going to go through the minimum technical requirements and the certifications that are needed to actually get up and running with Orchestrator, kind of at a base level. Then we're going to go through some Studio components. And then we'll just wrap up with some additional resources. And within all of this, I'm going to be doing a demonstration showing you kind of live what we can do with the Orchestrator just from a basic level. So what is Orchestrator and what is first introduced as the IoT Orchestrator with tools release 9.155? And this really matured over the last 3 years now to become a really robust tool for doing these integrations with JDE. There was of course business services, but there was not the integration to this level that actually integrated with the views and the screens of JDE. You had to kind of go that business function route. But now, after evolving through the IoT Orchestrator, they just call it the Orchestrator or Orchestrator Studio, which is able to do just that, orchestrate the transactions with JDE. Now, just as a note, when people say Orchestrator, they really mean the Orchestrator Studio, because the Orchestrator Studio is actually that piece that puts everything together, but it's just shortened as the Orchestrator at this point. So again, the Orchestrator Studio, it's a separate web client. Component itself, and it runs on application releases 9.0, 9.1, and 9.2. So they're kind of decoupled in that way, but you do need that separate web component. The Orchestrator UDOs run actually on the AIS server. So you probably have heard AIS server thrown around a lot, the application interface server. That server does need to exist, and the Orchestrator Studio actually points to that AIS server to facilitate those transactions. So really, everything is actually running on that AIS server instance, and that's what does the heavy lifting in this case. And the orchestrations, again, they serve as a wrapper around a potential set of AIS or external API calls or different types of what we call service requests in the actual orchestration. And they can be scheduled, they can called via the orchestrated client, which I'll show on this webinar in a demo, and they can also be called externally via their automatically published endpoint. So just keep those in mind as we're going through this, that there's a few different ways to actually run these orchestrations. And one of the most interesting ways is to truly call it via that external endpoint that is published. When you're creating orchestration, that's kind of how you do your external integrations. On the bottom here, we have just a nice flow has provided actually. This is where on the left side, you'll see devices and gateways. So you have to think of this as your external integration. So with the IoT Orchestrator, it was initially those devices, but now of course, it could be an external web page, it could be an external client that's making a call in. As that data is fed in, you'll see that dashed line where it kind of crosses over into the orchestration. And that orchestration could have a whitelist, could have some rules, cross references, and really the heavy lifting is done within those. You'll see there where it's flagged form or Java, but in most cases, you're doing a form request into those JDE applications on the far right side, how you see that PXX where you're doing your interactive applications. And that's what that AIS server does, kind of right there in the middle where that little cloud is to facilitate those transactions with JDE. And again, I can't stress enough that all of this runs on top of those JDE applications. So all the logic that's encapsulated in those applications within the buttons and the views in JDE, if you're opening a screen and you're clicking the find button, the same thing is done in these service requests to actually facilitate that transaction. So all the logic is not even replicated, it's just utilized just as it is in those applications. And any changes that are actually made, if you have custom applications, they're actually using that same logic as well when using the orchestrator or our Orchestrator Studio, if you will. So let's jump into some MTRs and certifications. So you'll see a quick list here, and on the left side, you'll see the Orchestrator Studio version, which there's been a few more versions since then, since we actually took this data out of Oracle. But the Orchestrator Studio version you'll see is coupled with the tools release. So if you're using 7.0, you have to have at least 9.2.3 for a minimum tools release. And then it logic version. So we see some customers, of course, have logic in preparation for the new Orchestrator Studio versions. But then on the right side, you just have a few different pieces of data. So expanded Orchestrator data imports and formats for CSV is a huge piece, and that comes with the Orchestrator Studio 7. With older tools releases, if you're a few tools releases back, which a lot of customers are, we're looking at kind of the 6.0 or the 6.1 version of the Orchestrator Studio, which has a lot of that base functionality in those 6.0 versions as well. If I jump to the next slide, you can see just stepping back a few more tools releases. Again, we go back to Orchestrator Studio 5.1 and 5.0. So these are really where that base functionality came up, where it just Orchestrator Studio was just starting out. You do get some of the really nice functionality, as you can see kind of in that note, where you can chain those transactions together, but you're not going to get that latest and greatest, so to speak. But you do get that base functionality if you are at those tools releases 9.2.1, 9.2.1.2, of course, and above. But it's a good place to start for sure. So here's just a really quick grid that's showing us the particular tools releases on the bottom right corner where we're going to want to be to get to those tools releases, of course, and we've highlighted them. So install requirements and setup. So this is just a really high flyby of really what these components are. So the Orchestrator components are, of course, available at the Update Center on Oracle, just as any other web component or any of other your components that you're installing are. And you search for Enterprise One Orchestrator in this case if you want to grab those. The Orchestrator Studio is installed much like any other web component in Server Manager, basically put into place the same way. There are a couple of configurable pieces, of course, that are a little bit different than those web components, but for the most part, it gets put in place the same way. It'll be configured, of course, like I said before, the Orchestrator Studio component is configured to point to an AIS server instance. So you'll have maybe a DV instance of Orchestrator, and that points to a DV instance of your application integration, your AIS server, and then of course that AIS server points to a DV web instance. But you do need to make sure you point at kind of a one-to-one relationship there. And the recommendation is, and what we've seen with a lot of customers, is that we have at least 2 AIS server instances set up, or 2 AIS servers. You can kind of put testing on one, so DV and PY maybe on one server, and then segregate that production server off to the side so that nothing is affected. If you're doing kind of a heavy testing load, it doesn't slow down that server and in turn impact that production instance, of course. And the typical setup that we've seen and that we've kind of been configuring is that the AIS instance is on a dedicated server, and then the Orchestrator Studio instance is on a separate server. Again, you have that Studio instance and that AIS instance, and then the AIS instance, of course, points to your web server. You can put those both on the same server if you're not doing a ton of heavy lifting. Once you've created that Orchestrator Studio, that orchestration via Orchestrator Studio, the Orchestrator Studio actually isn't necessary anymore. So if you don't have a huge heavy load, then you can actually kind of put those together and save some servers. But again, we do see, and the typical setup is that those are separated because the Orchestrator Studio does do some heavy lifting. In the future, just to give you kind of a snapshot, it's looking like, and of course, there's no guarantees until anything is released, but it's looking like Oracle is actually going to couple those together. So you won't have a separate Orchestrator Studio instance, and we'll be able to consolidate down so that the AIS instance is actually just the only instance that well, the AIS server is the only server that you need, and they'll both be running on the same instance there. This is just kind of a high flyby of, we recommend 1 logical CPU for each AIS and ADF JVM combination. ADF is required in a way for Orchestrator Studio because it is running on ADF. It comes with the Orchestrator Studio. And we recommend a minimum of 8 GB of memory on those machines. Here's a document ID. This is an Oracle Doc ID, just in case you wanted to go in and look for the Orchestrator Studio MTRs and installation requirements. So there's that for you if you'd like to look yourself. All right, so now what we're going to do is we're actually going to drop into a quick demo. Let me get this set up really quick for us. I will put this together. Okay. So here we are. This is, of course, our sandbox that we have at Syntax. But we have an Orchestrator instance, so we actually keep this instance fairly up to date. So I'm going to show you a few of the new pieces that we're actually able to utilize. But this is what your Orchestrator Studio is going to look like. So just from a base level, this is what you're going to log in as and what it's going to look like. I'm actually going to close these tabs and I'll reopen them in a moment. So here we are. You have an environment, of course. For us, we're going into our development environment. So we're going to go into JDV 920. In Server Manager, when the Orchestrator is installed and when AIS is installed, you do have to whitelist the users that are going to use the Orchestrator Studio. That's kind of a gotcha that we like to highlight, just in case you get tripped up. If you don't do that, you're going to get a sign-on error that says the user isn't whitelisted, but we already have that all set up, of course. So here's just our general login. So we click the login button, and this is the screen that we're greeted with. So of course, we have the orchestrations, which are on the left side. Oracle has kind of put this divider in. So you have the overarching notifications, which are the larger baskets that are actually taking care of these pieces. So that's where we kind of, I guess, have all the pieces put into. And on the right side, you have more of the building blocks, okay? So on the right side, these building blocks, these service requests, the cross references, the whitelist, the rules, and we'll look at a couple more, are what go into an orchestration to really do anything useful. The orchestration is, again, just kind of an encapsulating feature or a shell to put all of these components in. Also, I'm going to click on tools here, and I'm going to show you, you can see we have the orchestrator client, which is actually to run the orchestrations themselves. But the different pieces I wanted to show you are on the bottom here where we have connections. Connections are for external interfaces, which I might show you a couple of in just a moment. And then we also have schedules. So you can schedule orchestrations to run every day, every week, every month, every hour. You can basically choose exactly when you want them to run. And then when you start the orchestrator scheduler, which is actually separate from your job scheduler, those will run on the schedule that is defined for them. And again, keep in mind that all of these components, almost all of them, are user-defined objects. So a user-defined object can have another user-defined object defined within it, but these all these components, the schedules, and all the components that you're seeing here, service requests, cross-references, orchestrations, notifications, these are all user-defined objects. So let's basically dive in and let's look at the basic component of an orchestration and what that really looks like. So if I go into service requests, you'll see I can click on this icon right here, and that actually brings me to the service request building screen. And on the upper left-hand corner, you'll see that I have service requests highlighted, and it says create service requests. So I can click this button, and it gives me all the different types of service requests that are available to me that I can build. So in our case, like I was saying, a lot of the service requests we're going to build are going to be called form requests. And these are requests that are interfacing with those applications in JDE. We have a few different options, which I'll just go through really quick, and we'll look more in depth on a couple of these in a moment. But we have custom service requests, which a custom service request is Groovy scripting. It takes a little bit of development background knowledge to actually do these custom Groovy scripts. But in order to do extra functions or kind of more in-depth things, if you're not just doing a form request, if you want to pull in external data and actually pivot on that data, add it together, convert it, do mathematical operations, all those things can be done within those custom service requests. The next type of service request is a data request, and this is to be thought of much like a data browser. So you can go directly to a view or a table within JDE and pull out data. You can feed in filters, you can bring out different columns of data, just as if you're kind of building manually a SQL statement. And again, this utilizes, and it can be thought of as a data browse. And it's usually actually utilizing the data browser on the back end to create, complete that operation. Message is another step. So messages, of course, are to actually send messages out of JDE. We also have a connector. This connector actually uses what we saw before, which is those connections. And this is how we utilize an external interface. Or actually, if you're going a little bit more in depth and you want to call another orchestration, let's say we have built an orchestration to do a specific operation, 2 or 3 service requests within it, and we want to call that orchestration from within another orchestration, we do that through a connector. Watch lists, if you're familiar with watch lists in JDE, this is kind of the same thing. It watches for data, and you can define those within here. And then the report, which is exactly what you might think it is. It's actually running a report within JDE. You can define exactly what report you want. You can pass in data from the beginning, from the orchestration inputs or from a previous service request. whatever output that might be, you can pass that into the report and kind of run that report in a specific way depending on what data is coming in before it. So with basically the newest Orchestrator instance that we have here, the Orchestrator Studio, those are the service requests that are available. If you're on a previous instance, on a previous tools release, you might see a few less of these. They'll just be less in the list. The report, for example, came in just a few tools releases back, so you might not have the report functionality. There's a few others that will drop off the list if you go back even further in tools releases, but for the most part, most will have this entire list. Now, with the report, like I said, it came in with a little bit newer of a tools release. That doesn't limit you if you have a button, let's say, doing a form request, then clicking a specific button runs a report, that can still happen. So there are ways to kind of get around and utilize this newer functionality without the newest tools releases if you have a specific setup in JDE. It doesn't limit you. It just, Oracle included these native requests in this way, in this form, in newer tools releases. By the way, before we go into the create that service request, if you ever want to know what studio version you're on, if I come to the top right corner here and I click the little down arrow, you'll see where it says studio version, and it's actually going to give you a link of what AIS server you're pointed at, and it's also going to give you the specific studio version that you're currently running. Also, if you were to import files, you can reload the files from here. You can go home and do your logout. But if you ever ask for your studio version, or you ever want to know once you are installed, or if you're curious right now and you do have an Orchestrator and you want to go in, this is where you'll see your studio version, and then that's how you kind of reference your different tools releases and different functionality that you might have is via that studio version right there. Okay, so let's get started. Let's just create a simple service request. So we're going to go for a form request. This is one of the simplest requests that there is. However, it does get a lot more complex within these form requests, and it's most utilized service request that really is. Most of the time, actually, we build form requests. That's almost all we do. So we'll go right into the form request here. So here's your form request screen. In here, we have the opportunity to name the specific form request. In this case, I'm going to call it address book inquiry. And this is just a naming convention. You can choose whatever naming convention you actually want. In my specific case, I like to put the date in the service request name to just know what date I actually created a specific service request, but that is by no means mandatory. It's really up to you and what you want to do. I also, we recommend at Syntax, but again, it's totally up to you. We recommend not using spaces in the service request name. I typically use an underscore. You can use a dash as well, but to avoid spaces, because actually when you're creating these service requests and you go out and if you in the future would like to call these via an external interface, those spaces will have to be encoded instead of being spaces because it's a URL. Things can get a little bit weird if you're having to deal with the spaces and replace those with a %20 as in a URL. It's just nicer not to have to do that. So we don't put spaces in, but again, totally up to your preference. And if you're only utilizing these within the Orchestrator Studio, then by all means, it'll be no problem. Product code, you have the opportunity to give a product code. Let me reload that actually. Let's see. So product code here, you can put in any number that you want. 55 is of course custom. However, of course, all service requests that we're creating are kind of custom. So this is, again, just a category that you want to put in. In our case, we might put in 01 because this is an address book inquiry. But again, you can put in whatever number you want here, depending on how you want to categorize it. So again, we're going to go 01 because we're doing address book. And then you have the ability to say this is an address book inquiry. You can put in any type of definition that you want here. Simple address book inquiry though, this is again just for purposes of a developer, if somebody wanted to come in and figure out exactly what you were doing, you might have an easier this way. So I'm going to click the Save button. I like to save the request, the form request, in the beginning as soon as possible. As soon as we have really that title or that name, I like to save it. That gives us the ability to roll back just in case something goes wrong. Save early and often is always what we say. So in this case, I've already saved it. Just wanted to make sure I had it available. The name does work out. I did the save. After we save it, we're going to go down to the application. And in this case, we'll go P01012. This is, of course, the address book. And then we hit the tab key on the keyboard. When we hit the tab, you'll see that this form has now expanded and it's highlighted. And after you load an application, it actually gives you all of the forms that are available via that application. So in this case, we're going to do work with addresses. That's the entry point of the address book form, but you can choose any of these if you want to use a different form. Of course, again, if you have a custom application, you can utilize any of the custom forms that are available. If it's not an entry point, of course, you're going to have to respect whatever processing options might have been in the background or, form interconnects that might be happening. So it's best practice to go in via an entry point, just as if you were using an application, because otherwise things might get a little weird. But again, just personal preference. Here, like I said, we're going to go in via the work with addresses. In this specific case, we don't care what version we're using, so I'm just going to leave the version blank. And the form, I'm doing an inquiry, so I'm going to go ahead and say inquiry. Some of the forms, of course, matter on what way you're entering them, if it's an add or an update or an inquiry. In this specific case, it doesn't actually matter, but I will flag it as an inquiry just for best practice as well. Bypass form processing, we're going to leave this unchecked. It doesn't matter in this case as well, but there actually is an ability when using AIS, if you've designed all of your event rules properly, you can bypass some form processing as it might not matter. And if you know that it doesn't, you can bypass it. And for speed, you can actually AIS call in your orchestration if you're using that bypass form processing. So now what I did is I clicked this button, which loaded all of the inputs and in fact outputs to this form. But you'll see here we have the buttons and the exits, which I'll minimize really quick. We have the QBE line, which is of course that filter line at the top of the grid. And then we have, of course, the grid. So we have the different grid elements. And of course, these are not editable because the grid elements are being returned to us and not editable on this form. So I'll minimize that as well. So the first thing that we're going to do, because this is just a very simple address book inquiry, is we're going to name a variable here. So we're going to call this address number. This is, of course, the column that has the address book number in it. And we're going to name it again, that address number. And then we click this button right at the right side. And this actually adds the action, which is assigning the address number to whatever input we might want. And then you see at the top, the mapped variable now is address number, which is exactly what we wanted. So when using this service request, we'll see in just a little bit how the address number can be input. And when the address number comes in, it gets assigned to this column of the QBE line. So as you all know, in the address book inquiry, you go in, and when you're in address, you enter an address number and do nothing else, nothing will happen. The grid will not be populated and no data will be returned. So that's always an interesting piece that trips people up, trips me up a lot as well, is if you don't click a find button or if you don't click anything else on the screen in this AIS call, nothing will happen and nothing will be returned. So we do need to add this action for find as well. And the order of execution at the top is very important. So you see here, we're assigning the address number and then we're clicking the find button. Now, if we, for example, had it in this direction, we would click the find button, which would do an open find, and then we would assign the address number and it wouldn't actually filter for that address number. So it's very important to respect your order of execution. In this case, of course, it's a very simple order of execution. We're only going to do a couple steps. But if you're doing something a little bit more complex, you do need to be careful because you could potentially have a step before you wanted it to be, and the find button wouldn't be at the end. And then in that case, of course, the screen isn't going to act exactly the way you wanted it to. So now that we have those two very simple pieces to the form request, I will click the save button here again. And that resaves the service request again, of course, with our order of execution. Again, just to highlight, we have all of the buttons here. We can add them to the order of execution if we want. Display addresses, display phone. You can see here there's checkboxes. In this case, like the display phone checkbox, we're not going to do that, but we potentially could. The last piece that's very important is to select what data that you actually want returned. So in this case, we haven't actually selected any columns or anything to be returned, but we'd like, let's just say we'd like to know the address name, and we'd like to know the search type, and heck, we want to know the long address number as well. So these three fields we're going to return back, and that's actually going to be in our return when we run this service request, and actually when we run the orchestration at the top level. Those are the pieces of data that are going to be returned to us. So we've checked those three boxes, and you'll see at the top here, if I actually go in, let's see, we can actually see within this, well, first of all, I guess we can look in the options. These are just put on there automatically. If you want to limit the number of rows, you can limit your rows, you can limit your page size. In this case, none of this really matters to this specific request, but under the return values, this little arrow, if I click, you can see now I have in the first grid, I have return IDs 20, 50, and 48 in that order are what are going to be returned. And those are actually, again, the values that I just selected below. They get added to the return IDs. If you happen to know all of your return IDs, you can manually enter them in here if you really want to, but in this case, we're just going to enter them in like that, and none of the other fields actually we want returned. We just want those in the grid. So we'll click the OK button, and again, we will save the service request for the third time, and that now has defined our inputs, it's defined our service request name, and it's defined the outputs that are going to come back. Okay, so with all of those, we can now close this screen. We can click the X. So now we have a service request, and with that service request, that's actually just the beginning, really, of our specific call, because you can't call a service request directly from outside of the Orchestrator Studio. You can't actually call a service request directly at all. What you need to do is you actually need to define an orchestration that encapsulates that service request. So what we're going to do is, actually, I'll come back here and I'll just explain. In that specific screen, the first screen, this is much like what we saw in the service request, right? So we have basically the same screen. You have your edit on the upper right. You still have your tools tab and you have your orchestrations on the top left, and you have a new orchestration instead of new service request, because this is where we create, of course, orchestrations. So we can click the new orchestration button, and just like we saw previously, we have now the ability to define an orchestration just like that service request. Now the bottom, of course, is a little bit different, but on the top, we can put in address book inquiry again. And you can see here, the version is by default put in. So in this specific case for our tools release, this is a version 3 orchestration, but you might see version 1, version 2, you'll see different versions actually show up for your specific tools releases, which is totally fine. They're just created along the way on the different versions. It's not actually anything that you need to worry about, but that's just, you know, as you progress on tools releases, you'll see those different versions. Again, we have the ability to put in product code. I'll put in an 01 just like before, and we'll leave the description blank. You can see I forgot to put in the date, so I'll go ahead and put in the date again just for best practice. And then we'll save it. Just like I said before, we save this orchestration just like we save the service request as early as possible. So what that now allows us to do is we can click this plus next to orchestration steps. And you can see here, if I scroll down, we have the ability to add any of these building blocks that I was talking about, the cross-reference, the rule, and the service request, and whitelist. And in this case, we're going to go for a service built it as a service request, but with more complex orchestrations, you'll of course be adding more of these pieces, but in most cases, service request is the most common. So we'll go here and we'll actually click the plus. now we have our first service request added to the orchestration, and you'll see here we have a little down arrow. So if I click the down arrow, we now have all of service requests that we have created. So specifically in this case, we're going to grab this address book inquiry that we just built, and now we can see the address number. And because I didn't define a version, it allows me to define a version here as well and kind of hand that through from the orchestration over to the service request. But in this case, again, we don't care about version, so we'll just leave it blank. But you can see here I have address number. Now, if I go to available values, these are the orchestration level values that are available to me. So we have the user address number, which is my username, the address book number associated with my. We have my username, we have the system date, and the orchestration input. Now, we haven't defined any of these yet, so we'll have to go over to the right side here. So you'll see under orchestration inputs, we don't have any values here. And in this specific case, the easiest way to add the values is to click this little button here, which is the Add Inputs to Orchestration button. So you'll see I click that button, and both inputs are automatically mapped to the orchestration inputs. So again, you have to kind of conceptualize how the orchestration can take a number of inputs and hand them to a number of service requests. In this case, we only have one orchestration to one service request, but potentially you could have a lot of different service requests in here. But here, when we do the auto map, it just adds all of those in. And actually, when we come across here, there's another button here, which is the auto map function, which actually does the transformations, and it brings across the inputs from the orchestration and maps them right into the service request for us. And again, in this case, we don't care about the version, so I'm just going to delete that version from my input, and we'll just leave it blank here. No big deal. It will use the default version. But in your specific case, you might want a specific version to be input, and in that case, you'd want to make sure to input that version. So for us, again, we just want the address book number to come across, so that's exactly what we have. It goes into the service request, and then it'll output to us those fields. Now, if I click Save again, you'll see here, these buttons on the bottom right, we have the opportunity to define the output. And the output is defined from the outputs that were, of course, defined in that service request that we had checked. So you'll remember that I checked those 3 different boxes and I added them to the outputs. And again, those were the 3 columns of that grid. So we have the alpha name, we have the search type, and we have the long address. In this case, I'm going to select the checkboxes for all 3 of those as well, and I'm going to click the OK button. So what that has done is that has defined the outputs to the overarching orchestration to have those 3 fields as well, so that we can actually pull those out. So now that we've built the entire orchestration, we have the address book inquiry, we can actually call that from the Orchestrator client. So you'll remember during the beginning of this presentation, I talked about being able to call from the Orchestrator client, being able to call externally, and then also being able to call from another orchestration. But in this case, we're going to just go specifically to the Orchestrator client and kind of do that demo piece. So what I'll do first is I will open JD Edwards here, and I will log in. We'll log into our DV environment, of course. And we'll open the address book. So with the address book, I just wanted to grab a few specific companies here. So let's say we have number 9, for example, address book number 9. So what I'll do now, and this is just basically to grab the data, but I have the Orchestrator client here. We click the Orchestrator client button, and that's actually loading from our AIS server. So what that's doing is it's taking the AIS server and it launches, and it's delaying a little bit here. Let me try to fix this. Here we go. It actually utilizes the AIS server, and it allows us to call this orchestration from the AIS server that we have. And I should have credentials in here, but let me grab them really quick. Okay. Those in there. So this is a perfect example, actually, because this is kind of our demo system. We have everything running on the same machine. And this is how I was saying we recommend you splitting the AIS instance from the Orchestrator instance, just so that everything runs a little bit quicker. So that's kind of our recommendation, is splitting them. And in this case, of course, they're together, so they run a little bit slower, but it works for these purposes, I guess. So going to the address book inquiry, we have the address number here. And again, remember I said that we'll use address number 9. So I can click run, and you'll see here it passes in the address number here of 9. And then it has our alpha name, our search type, and our long address that come out. So multi-site target company. I can put in a different address number, and I can run it again. And you'll see we get those 3 pieces as well. I think we had address book number 5 as well. And there's address book number 5. Another thing that we can do, because the address number field is of course a QBE line, is we can use operators like less than, greater than, equal to. So if I want to go less than 10, that should pass right through. And because we're actually only grabbing one record, we decided to only grab one record, it will grab the first record from the list. So even though I did less than 10 and there's multiple records there, it's only going to give me that first record from the list back, because we only selected that first record. We didn't tell it to return all rows in this case, which is another feature actually of the specific orchestrations, is you can return one row or return all rows, which allows you to just give back if there's any data there at all, or it gives you back the entire set of data. But that's just a quick demo of exactly how that address number can be utilized, and how we can feed data into it to feed to that orchestration. So let's bounce back to the orchestration one more time. And let's actually do this here, where we can go back to the service request. I'm just going to show you a really quick way to create another type of service request. So we have this data request. Again, this data request could be address book inquiry, and in this case we'll do 02 because 01 is already taken. We'll just leave the product code in the description blank, and then we'll save it. And again, you can go to a table name or a view name. And because I didn't load any criteria, of course, it didn't like that I was not saving anything. But in this case, let's just go to the 0101. Of course, this is the address book. And let's filter for address number. So again, this is defining kind of your inputs, right? This is defining your where clause of your SQL statement. So I want to filter for address number, and I want to return long address. I want to return alpha name, and this is really modeling it right after what we just did. In this case, I'm going to do long address as the output name and alpha name. So this is following along just kind of the form, like the form, but this is going directly to the table and the data, which actually speeds up the process as well. So you'll see the condition, when the condition was input, it has a $ and these curly braces. That's the typical way to indicate a variable, and it automatically inputs it for you. So we'll just leave it like that. And then we're returning these fields, which we can name however we'd like to name them. And now we'll click save. So now we have a basic data request. So again, we first went through form request, and now we're going through data request. This is going to output much the same data that we had before, but it's in a different way and maybe a little bit of a faster way, especially if we were returning many of the different columns. We don't have any of the form processing that's going on in the other case, because we're really going directly to the data. So let's close the screen. We'll bounce back over here. We'll go to orchestrations. And we're actually going to use the same shell that we actually defined before. And what we'll do here is we will just simply add another step. So we're actually going to do this inquiry kind of twice, just for a demonstration here. But here, once we've highlighted it, you'll see it's in blue. I can insert step after, and then I have the same ability to add any type of service request or form request here. So I'm going to add a service request, and this one's going to be a data request. So we'll see here we have the subtype is data request and address book inquiry. And you'll see here that we have an address number that we want to input. Now in this case, we can actually use the address number that we input at the top level. We'll use the same address number. So we're just going to define it as address number. So it goes in the same, and we'll click save. Now we'll open the define output, and you'll see here that we have the address inquiry 2, and we're going to select these 2 as well. And this is what I was talking about before. You see we selected these 3, but we didn't click return all rows. So in this case, we're going to return all rows of both of these to show when we do like a less than or a greater than. Actually, this one's not going to play well with that, but this one will return us some rows. So we'll not return all, we can return all rows. It might not like it very much, but that's okay. Keep in mind that when you're doing a data request, you're actually defining that operand in the data request. So you're not able to actually define like a greater than or less than in the input. That might, not like it very much, but we'll see what happens. So we'll click the OK. We'll save it one more time here. And then we'll go back over to the client. In this case, what we're going to do is an XML cache refresh, and we're actually going to clear the fields as well. What this does is it really refreshes, and this isn't an error. This is actually a message that comes up to say that all caches have been cleared. So this actually clears out the cache of the AIS server for these orchestrations, and it also reloads all of our inputs when we click clear. So we'll go to the inquiry again, and you can see it's showing us the 2 different outputs, and let's just put in address number 9 for this case. So you see here, we kind of have the 2, we have the address book inquiry 2 and the address book inquiry 1. And what this is doing, you'll see, is this one's using the form and this one's using the actual data browser. It's going directly to the data, but it gives us back much the same data. Now, as an example, you'll see when I do less than, likely the second one is not going to like it as much, right? So that's defining, it's giving us back 0 records because it's actually searching for that less than sign. But the first one is giving us back multiple records, you can see here. So we have 1 record here, another, and another, because there's 3 records that are less than 10 in this case. So really, that's just a high flyby of how you can use form requests, service requests, form requests, and service requests, data requests to get out your data in 2 different ways in these specific cases. Again, if I just went back to like the 1 without the greater than, or the less than, it's going to give us data back in both cases. As you can see here, 1 here and 1 there. There's no more records. It's just that 1 record. But that's just a really quick flyby of how you can define those and utilize those screens. Of course, this is just an inquiry. You can do changes. You can do updates. Everything is possible that you're actually utilizing via your web instance. Anything that your users are actually doing, they can do in the Orchestrator Studio as well. It's totally open in that respect. You can do the same thing in both cases. So we're going to bounce back here. I'm actually going to talk about a few different possibilities that we have here that you can actually have us help you out with. And then we'll move on to a few questions. We're getting close to kind of the question period. If you enter your questions in, we're going to actually pull some information as well. But please do enter those questions and then we'll answer them. Keith, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me, David?
Yeah, I can.
Excellent. So thank you. Detailed overview of of Orchestrator. And we want to give everyone a chance to, take a deeper dive. If you're really, really ready to go in and take a deep dive on Orchestrator, we're going to give everyone a free discovery call, leading to either an Oracle virtual training or an assessment. And you can see there our virtual training focus on getting you the foundation there. We do offer it via WebEx. We do offer training. If you're thinking more of kind of getting into Orchestrator services or deploying Orchestrator, we can help you do that assessment. Likewise, as you can see, the steps there in terms of how we overview your environment, help you define your gaps, and do your gap analysis, focus on documentation and that sort of thing. So I'm going to quickly put up a poll here. So if you want to go ahead and request that, just respond to the poll. Give me just a moment, and I will go ahead and start getting to the question and answer. We're going to start going here to the questions. One question I can answer right now that I'm sure has been asked as I started looking there. Yes, you will have a chance to, get a recording of this presentation. We'll be sending that out tomorrow by an email, so you'll be able to see that and look at that again and go in deeper dive. And likewise, if you want to go, need more detail or want to go whatever, request your session, and we'll get you set up with a one-on-one with Dave. So our first question is, what tools release is needed if you want to import a CSV file into Orchestrator?
So as we had, been looking at that grid before, with more recent tools releases, you can import you can actually import the CSV when you're using 9.2.3, I believe. But the one piece that you can actually do is we have worked on a few custom pieces. You can actually use the custom service request to bring in CSVs without having to have the most updated tools release. But with newer tools releases, as we saw in that grid, like we were looking at before, we're able to bring them in natively via the FTP upload.
Excellent, excellent. So we got a number of questions here. So Joanne wants to know, is IT usually the one who sets up Orchestrator?
Yes, so typically what you'll have is you'll have a CNC install the web instance of for Orchestrator and also AIS if you don't have it already. But yes, typically you'll see IT setting up Orchestrator. Now, to extend further on that question, we're actually typically seeing more business analysts setting up orchestrations. So when Orchestrator is set up from a base level to actually run, the initial setup is done by your CNCs, by your IT department. But beyond that, defining the orchestrations themselves, and with the trainings that we're putting in place at Syntax, and when we actually go out to customer sites and do these trainings, we're actually seeing a lot of BAs, business analysts involved as well in building those orchestrations out. So it's really both. It's a kind of a concert between your IT department setting it up from a base level, and then beyond that, your business analysts actually working, and maybe your power users even, in some cases, working on these orchestrations and building them out.
Okay, thank you, David. So our next question comes from, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing your name correctly. It's Priyanchi, and Priyanchi's asking how to define whether your output comes out in a CSV or an Excel file. I know we already asked a question about tools in that, but sure. How do we define that?
Sure. Yeah. So the previous question was maybe going to bringing in a CSV file. And again, you can do that natively with more recent tools releases. Now, outputting a CSV file, because all outputs, as you saw in the demos, are actually JSON formatted, you need to convert that JSON to CSV. Now, Oracle has a few examples on learnjde.com on how to do that, but depending on your specific use case, we can help you do that as well. And the way to do that is to feed your output from a specific service request, be it the address book or a sales order inquiry, and feed that through a custom service request. So the custom service request is, of course, again, Groovy. We've done this quite a few times, actually, with a few customers in formatting the different JSON output to then be taken in and used through Groovy, and then that outputs the CSV. And what will then happen is the CSV will be placed in a directory on, well, you can actually choose some of the directories, but it'll be placed in the temporary directory on your AIS server. And then beyond that, you can actually upload it to an FTP site or move it to where you might need it. But yeah, we'll go through a custom Groovy service request to actually make that CSV happen for any specific use case.
Thank you very much, David. So I'm going to go ahead and close that poll. If you, those of you who requested the one-on-ones, I'm going to be getting out to you today. If you, still want to request one after I close the poll, which I'm going to do right now. And David, you might, yeah, okay, so we're good. Just leave your contact. We have a couple more questions here. Let's try to get through as many as we can in the time we have remaining. So the question we have now is from, it looks like, Mike. Can you comment on any Oracle licensing requirements tied to using Orchestrator?
So just about a year and a half ago, Oracle actually brought in the licensing requirements to the core tools of JDE. So previously they did license separately, but retroactive as of a couple of years ago, which means everybody now has it within core tools. And of course, core tools you need to run JDE at all. So Orchestrator licensing is totally integrated. There should be no extra licensing requirements. Of course, you have to respect your licensing requirements for any module that the Orchestrator is using, but the Orchestrator itself doesn't have anything anymore.
Okay, thank you, David. And so we have another question here, and it looks like it's coming from Joanne again. And Joanne saying, for example, how can the user see the inquiry?
Right, so this goes back to exactly how you can utilize the orchestration. So the users can actually use the Orchestrator client. You could allow them to use the Orchestrator client, but also with that external endpoint, and we can get together after this and I could show you potentially how to use the external endpoint. And we've had a lot of customers define a custom web page where they're actually ingesting that data via the orchestration. So it'd be like on a custom web page or in a custom app that you could actually utilize that endpoint. So there's a few different options there.
Okay, I'm skipping around here because of time. So if you haven't answered your question, don't worry. We are going to get back to you. So we have Lorraine saying the display of information in the address book Orchestrator example looks. I can't see the full question here.
I can actually see it. So,
so
the question is that it looks a bit technical, and you know it's not as useful. That is right. It's output in a JSON format. We do have a few examples done of grabbing that via the external endpoint and kind of reformatting it in a nice way. It's actually not that difficult for a basic developer to take care of. But I do agree, in the Orchestrator client, it might look a little technical, but it's not actually that bad when we reformat it via the external endpoint. But yes, in the client, it is JSON, so it does look a little bit messy sometimes.
Okay. Okay. Well, look, we are at the top of the hour, and I, hear people jumping off, but I do want to thank everyone for joining us today, and I really want to thank you, David, for giving such a great presentation. I know questions pending that we have not answered. We are going to get answers to you. Okay. That happen. Okay. Thank you, David, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webcast on JD Edwards Continuous Innovation next week, and we will have much more in the pipeline as far as Orchestrator is concerned in the future. So thank you, David, for joining us.
Hey, thank you. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate your time.